I didn't expect the night to sound like a countdown, but on the first evening we dug in along the edge of that raw coral strip. The jungle ticked like a clock I couldn't see. Fat drops sliding from palm fronds into our foxholes. Beetles, clicking like tiny gears. The ocean exhaling impatient pulses beyond the tree line. We called it Henderson Field because the maps did, but on the ground it felt like a lung we were trying to keep breathing with shovels and sweat. My rifle smelled like factory oil and salt, my hands like iodine and mud, and the air stuck to my skin as if the island wanted to wear me. A flare hissed somewhere to our left, coughing a sick green over the palms, and for an instant I saw the corrugated ribs of a Quonset hut shining like fish scales, and the faces of the men beside me gone pale as ghosts. Then the dark swallowed us again, and the clock kept ticking, and I told myself, stay small, stay quiet, stay here. That should have helped. It didn't. And what made it worse was the feeling, no, the certainty, that something out there was listening back. We were a necklace of foxholes and logs around a strip of sticky mud and steel matting that aircraft skimmed like dragonflies when they came in low enough to live. By day, we dragged fuel drums and laid down pierced steel planking until our palms felt flayed. By night, we tried to keep from thinking of the fast ships that would run down the slot and throw fire at us for sport. The sergeant, Nolan, tall shoulders, voice like grit stirred into warm water, touched his helmet brim to mine and said, "Keep your head below the lip, Joe. Tracers are pretty. Pretty gets you dead." I grunted something that meant I understood, and then the horizon blinked like an eye too bright to look at, and the guns out there became the guns on us, and the ground decided it wanted to be a different shape for a while. The first shells stitched the far end of the field, punching holes big enough to swallow trucks. The next slapped the palms into showers of spears and leaves. The next found a fuel revetment and gave the sky an orange mouth. A man yelled for "Corpsman," another yelled "Incoming," as if the word could tea-kettle steam out of the shell before it hit. I pressed my cheek to the rifle's stock until the wood warmed against my skin, and measured the seconds between blasts like counting lightning back home. That kind of arithmetic doesn't save you. It just keeps your mind busy enough to stay. Dawn made everything look like a lie someone told on purpose. Smoke stacked in blue-gray columns. The tents down the line were craters cupping pools of black water. A single boot stood upright like a tombstone without a name. We worked the way. Men work when they're afraid of stopping, backfilling holes, hauling planking, tying a rib cage of logs where the wire sagged. We ate rubbery eggs from a can and coffee that tasted like rain and gasoline, and we talked about nothing, because nothing was safer than something. By noon, the word came we'd push a patrol into the trees just to get a look. Just a look is what commanders say when the map is hungry and needs a little blood. We slid into the jungle, and the jungle swallowed us without moving. Sunlight died in the first 20 steps, turned to green soup in the next 20, and then decided to live only in brief stripes that made everybody look like prisoners of a place we hadn't asked to visit. Vines with the thickness of a wrist looped around our ankles like bored snakes. Somewhere above us, a bird made a sound like a rusty hinge. Somewhere ahead, the smell changed from salt to sweet rot. Nolan brushed 2 fingers across a strip of unusually smooth dirt and brought them up to his nose. "Fresh," he said, and none of us asked how he knew because the air itself had the taste of footsteps. Riley was laughing about the ancient cigarettes in his ration pack when his boot towed a wire thin as a hair. The blast didn't crack, so much as shove, a rude palm that picked him up and repositioned him in the world. 10 feet over, on his side, eyes wide, mouth making a small O the size of a secret. The jungle inhaled, held, and something human-shaped slid through a screen of fern, then another, then a dozen, low, quick bayonets long enough to make the air feel narrower. We opened because training makes a man faster than fear, and the jungle filled with sound. Rifles coughed. A grenade skipped like a bad idea and then made its case. The smell of cordite braided into leaf rot, and the air got heavy with invisible metal that found bark, leaves, cloth, and sometimes the soft thing behind it. We dragged Riley on a ripped-off door because that's what we had, and we told him the kind lies men bring to an emergency. You're okay. He nodded like he'd heard and believed. By dusk, he wasn't nodding, and the island's small crabs began their quiet work because everything that falls here becomes the island in time. That night, I learned the part nobody tells you before. You ship out. The hours between fights hurt worse than fights do. In the breaks, the jungle's clock ticks louder, and the distance between you and the next breath appears to lengthen by miles. I told myself they would come again. The whisper agreed, and I wasn't ready for how right it felt. They came when the sky turned the color of a bruise. First politely, probing bursts from the tree line, a fox sniffing at a door. We answered with measured fire, cautious, stingy, saving what we'd need when the door blew open. The chaplain, who stood where no man should and prayed where prayer seemed out of place, murmured, "Lord, steady their hands," then flinched a second late as a shell shaved a palm to a frayed brush. The second push tried the low ground, where we'd convinced the earth to sprout wire and stakes. It sang the ugly song we'd written for it. Screams arrived in the air and left it again as if embarrassed. Then the third wave forgot the first two and came like weather. They poured out of the black-green in a rush thick enough to feel on the skin, white headbands catching stray light, a sword lifted by someone who had been told he should carry it. He went down. Another hand lifted the sword. He went down too, but the wave didn't stop because a wave is many hands and few anchors. Our gun stuttered, and then resumed its speech. Our rifles made the same hard argument to the night. My buddy Levy tried to stand and folded instead, and I reached for him with a hand that belonged to someone who hadn't learned yet that reaching is a luxury under certain stars. The line on our left tried to curl into itself like a wounded animal. "Plug it," Nolan said, pointing with 2 fingers, like he was flagging a taxi on a calm street. Morgan and I took the gun by its hot cradle and shouldered through mud that wanted to keep us. Bullets wrote thin, urgent letters in the air around our heads. A palm frond exploded into rain. We slid into the torn place and fed the gun belt like priests bringing bread to mouths, and the night's tone shifted, a key change you feel in your chest. When the last rush wobbled and dissolved and the jungle exhaled, the silence that arrived had weight. We counted the living because you always do that first. We buried Levy behind the new log wall because you eventually do that too. A can of peaches traveled down the line like communion, and sweetness made men animals briefly, grateful and honest. The TokyoExpress was a promise carved into the ocean, and promises of that sort keep themselves. I washed my hands in the rain with the thin brown cake of soap my sister Daisy had mailed, and thought the act too small for the world around it. Which is to say, it was exactly right. We slept in scraps and woke by accident. Work replaced sleep because the field needed fussing if it was to remain a thing airplanes could trust. Fuel. Sandbags. Wire pulled taut like an argument. A pilot landed too fast at noon, skipped like a rock thrown wrong by a kid, and climbed out with his eyebrows lifted in a face that asked us if we, too, had just seen a miracle. We whooped like men at a ball game, because other people's luck rubs off in war for a minute. That night the breeze turned and brought rot from the interior instead of salt from the coast, and the jungle's clock found a new tempo. Drip, drip, drip. The ritual matters when a man has nothing left to bargain with. I tied my canteen so I wouldn't kick it. I stacked 2 grenades where my hand would land without asking my eyes. I wrote H and L on my palm, high, low, because memory narrows when fear widens. I folded Daisy's letter back into its waxed paper sleeve, read the line about the river flood one more time, and told myself, if ordinary words can survive the crossing, maybe I can survive this night. The first shots tore leaves, the second tore air. A flare clawed up and painted the world as if we were under green water. Men running crouched, the wire trying to be a spiderweb big enough to cover a world, the palms lit like ribs. The flare died, and the dark bit harder. A runner pitched into the mud and whispered, "Right's folding," and I didn't wait for Nolan's 2 fingers this time. Morgan and I dragged the gun by the business end because urgency burns the idea of safe right out of you. A round scraped my cheek with heat and left nothing but a hot wetness I didn't examine. We slid into a hole that smelled of fear. Recently evacuated and fed the gun so it could do the loud arithmetic that moves men backward. I picked targets by motion because faces are for letters sent home, and trouble reserved for daylight. Somewhere behind us, Trig counted seconds between bursts to time when he'd lift and fire. 1,000, 1,000, and his counting steadied me more than any prayer I'd heard. Dawn finally arrived, dusty and reluctant. The kind of light that feels like someone else's cigarette smoke blown into your room. We lifted our heads and saw a place that had been busy all night and tried to go still again. We moved forward slow, rifles hunting, boots finding only mud and old wood, stepping around the aftermath with the careful courtesy of men entering a church they didn't plan to join. We buried who we could and marked who we couldn't, because families far away would ask exactly where a heart stopped, and answering is a duty that feels like respect. I carried Levy's tags until a supply officer with clean fingernails and tired eyes took them from me, wrote in a book, wrote on a card, wrote on a line, and gave me a look I recognized from my father at the harvest, one that said, "We count because counting is how we put the world back together." Back at the line, we put the world back together with wire and logs and jokes. Someone produced a deck of cards, damp, bowed, still a deck. We played for bragging rights we'd forget before noon. A plane came in wrong again and left right, and our laughter was a way of telling the island we still had lungs. The chaplain found me with 2 cups of coffee that tasted faintly of kerosene and said, "You boys are holding more than ground out there." I didn't know what he meant until he pressed a small book into my hand, Psalms, thumbed soft and said, "If you can't say the words, let them say themselves next time." I did not become a better man that night. I became a man who understood that sometimes words you don't own can keep your hands from shaking while you reload. We learned the shape of the attacks the way a fisherman learns the river. Probes, flanks, weather, the odd shot intended to map our nerves. We also learned that courage, the kind you can count, isn't a roar but the agreement 2 men make in a hole to stay 5 seconds longer than they want to. I caught myself whispering to the dark, negotiating like a kid. "Let us get through this night and I'll stop cussing. I'll write Daisy more. I'll be kind." The dark took my terms and gave me nothing in writing, which is how most bargains are struck when cannon are involved. When the next big push came, the ocean wind hauled it in like a kite on a string. You could smell the ships before you heard them, hear them before you felt the ground lift under their work. We hunkered small. The field took hits and took them again. Our Quonset huts rattled like drums. The wire sang. A palm trunk detonated into 1,000 splinters that pinpointed the night. I felt my heart knock against my ribs like a man trying to get out. And then, we never could say why, a lull. 5 breaths long. 10. The kind of pause that ruins men who mistake it for mercy. Nolan's silhouette moved along the line, pausing behind shoulders, pressing his hand onto a helmet crown and leaving it there long enough to share something unspoken. He reached me and said nothing. I don't think he knew my name most days. It didn't matter. Sometimes a hand on your helmet is more helpful than your own name called the right way. The flare we needed didn't come. The one they sent up did, and the world wore their light. Shadows chased the light to the edges of our vision, where fear does its best work. When they ran again, it felt like the night had written a new rule. Everything that moves does so at once. We made the wall talk. We made the rifle sing. We made the gun chew. And when a gap opened 2 positions down and somebody yelled, "Here, here," with that rising pitch that suggests the next shout will contain a prayer or a curse, Morgan and I didn't look for permission. The gun went with us because it had decided it preferred our hands. We fed it even anger. It repaid us with a corridor of emptiness 10 yards deep, which, in that moment, was a kind of miracle I would have paid money to keep. When the sun finally proposed to the horizon and was accepted, the jungle let color back into the conversation. The palms were notched and smoking. The wire hung in romantic curves. The field steamed like a giant was blanching it. We found a pilot sitting on a fuel drum, helmet in his lap, looking at nothing with a practiced patience that said he'd trained to live and was tired of the exam. He said, "Do we still have a field?" Nolan said, "Look under your feet." The pilot looked down at the mud, at the steel matting, at the thin world we'd kept, and he smiled in a way that made me believe in pictures you take only with your head. I wrote Daisy that night, told her about the peaches, the chaplain, the pilot who smiled like a man who had just remembered his own address. I didn't tell her about Levy's tags or Riley's door. There are edits you make to keep someone else's sleep kind. If that's a kind of lie, it's the sort the world requires in wartime. I folded the letter and wrote on the back, small, "We are staying." I didn't know then how true that would become, or how expensive a sentence could be. The typhoon that hit us 2 weeks later wasn't the enemy we trained for, but it took to the job with enthusiasm. Palms bent until they found reasons not to stand. The field became a sheet of skating mud. Our metal huts shuddered, and then laughed at the wind, and it was the first time I loved a building. We lashed everything that could move. We lashed ourselves to the idea that the island would not take us that day. When the storm's mouth passed, our line looked like it had been combed by a giant with poor patience. We rebuilt what broke and saluted what didn't. There's courage in standing to fire. There's another kind in getting up after the storm and retying rope with fingers that won't unclench. That evening, we found a photograph in the mud. Foreign script on the back. A family in front of a house that could have been in California if you squinted. I thought then of the men who'd run against us and of the letters they didn't send. It did not make me softer, only more precise in my grief. Precision is something you learn when every mistake gets measured in names. They tried us again the next week and the week after. Each time we were a little different, leaner, quieter, better at seeing with our ears. Each time, the night shoved hard, and we shoved back with muscles built of sleep loss and stubbornness. Each time, we made the same agreement without speaking. 1 more minute, 1 more inch. When relief finally rolled down the jungle path like a rumor that had decided to be true, it brought men with faces that hadn't yet heard the jungle's clock. We looked at them the way old men look at boys wearing their own suits. We didn't say welcome. We handed them our shovels and showed them where the ground makes sense and where it doesn't. My turn to leave came like a bad joke. Orders stamped, names read, a boat, a deck that moved under my boots in a way that made my stomach remember its job. I stood at the rail and watched the tree line slide backward in a trick my eyes knew, but my heart didn't, and I thought, the island will not miss me, and I will never stop hearing it. I pressed my fingers to the wood and tried to remember how it felt to sleep without listening for the next thing. The sea said nothing back, which is the sea's favorite reply. What I carried home wasn't a map of battles. It was a handful of textures, the tacky feel of steel planking under a boot heel, the way a can of peaches tastes when you've made it to morning, the weight of a hand on a helmet when words can't do the job, the smell of palm sap cut by powder, the sound of Morgan's laugh when our gun coughed itself back to life, as if it were embarrassed to have quit, the sight of Nolan's shoulders set, moving along the line like a rumor of safety, and the quiet, steady tick of an invisible clock that does not respect your wish to forget. When I woke at 3 a.m. in a quiet house years later, I went to the kitchen and put on coffee, because that is a thing a man can do for himself when memory shows teeth. I sat at the table and listened to the drip from the faucet. Drip, drip, I did not flinch. I said aloud the names I still had and the names I didn't, and I let the clock speak until it grew bored and stopped. That was the night I understood the truest thing the island taught. Holding a line is not just something you do with a rifle and a wall of logs. It's what one human does for another in the dark. With a voice or a hand or a can of peaches or a lie told gently for the sake of sleep. And it matters in war and in the world that limps after. We held because we were stubborn and scared, and unwilling to give the night what it asked for. We held because the field behind us kept breathing when we did. We held because someone had to, and on those nights it turned out we were the ones standing in the wrong place to do it. Historians can measure that in tonnage and sorties and ships sunk and divisions fed. I'll remember it as 7 men in a hole agreeing, again and again, that this inch had our names on it. If you ask what courage feels like when it's not being photographed, I'll tell you. It feels like a calm voice saying, "Plug it," and 2 pairs of hands lifting a hot piece of iron without arguing about who's first. Tastes like syrupy peaches after a night that tried to erase you. It sounds like a chaplain praying off-key and a pilot laughing too loud at his own survival. It smells like rain on powder and salt in canvas. It looks like dawn arriving like an apology, and you accepting it because morning is a truth you're willing to believe, at least for a few hours. And if you ask me whether I would do it again, I'll give you the answer I gave the first time I heard the flare hiss into the sky and saw steel move between leaves. I will stay as long as the man on my right stays. And when he can't, I will hold for him until someone else puts a hand on my helmet and says, without needing to say it, that I'm not alone. If this story made you feel the mud under your boots or hear the jungle's quiet clock, tell me in the comments. Faced with that night on the edge of Henderson Field, what would you have done? Move, hold, or try to change the sky with your bare hands? I read every single comment, and your take keeps these memories alive for more than just the men who carried them. If you think more people should hear stories like this, tap like to push it farther, and subscribe to WW2 Struggles so you don't miss the next dive into the moments that shaped the war and the people who survived it. Your voice matters here. Share it below, and I'll see you in the next one.